Many people find themselves deeply moved by cosmic awakening or starseed style messages, and it is important to acknowledge that this resonance is real at the level of lived experience. Feeling seen, named, or reflected by a message can be powerful, especially for those who have spent much of their lives feeling out of place, misunderstood, or internally complex. Resonance does not arise randomly. It emerges from genuine emotional, psychological, and existential material that already exists within a person. When someone hears language about being different, sensitive, ancient, purposeful, or here for something meaningful, it often touches long-standing inner themes: a history of introspection, a tendency toward depth, early experiences of not fitting conventional molds, or periods of isolation that required inner resourcefulness. Validating this resonance means acknowledging that the response itself makes sense. It is not foolish, naive, or delusional to feel something when encountering symbolic language that mirrors one's inner world. Humans are meaning-making beings, and we are especially responsive to narratives that organize confusion into coherence and offer dignity to struggle. At the same time, validating the experience of resonance does not require validating the literal framework through which that resonance is explained. Feeling personally addressed by a cosmic or awakening message does not mean that the message is objectively sourced from a higher dimension, nor does it mean that it accurately describes one's origin, destiny, or role in the universe. Resonance is a psychological and embodied response, not a form of evidence. It reflects alignment between language and internal state, not confirmation of metaphysical truth. Many symbolic systems can generate deep resonance precisely because they are symbolic, open-ended, and emotionally rich. Mythology, religion, literature, and art have done this for thousands of years. The presence of resonance tells us that something meaningful is being touched, but it does not tell us what that meaning ultimately is, nor does it require us to accept the explanatory story attached to it. This distinction matters because resonance is often mistaken for proof. When a message feels precise, timely, or uncannily accurate, the nervous system may interpret that precision as external validation rather than internal recognition. The experience can feel as though something outside oneself has identified a hidden truth, but in reality, the mind is exceptionally skilled at pattern matching, especially during periods of heightened sensitivity, transition, or stress. When someone is already searching for understanding, identity, or reassurance, the threshold for resonance is lower and the intensity of response is higher. This does not make the experience invalid, but it does mean that intensity alone cannot be used to establish destiny, special status, or cosmic assignment. It is also important to clarify that resonance does not imply exceptionality. Feeling deeply connected to a message does not mean one has been singled out, chosen, or elevated above others. Many people resonate with the same material for similar reasons, even if those reasons feel intensely personal. The human tendency to personalize meaning can easily turn shared psychological patterns into narratives of individual uniqueness. While uniqueness exists at the level of personal history and temperament, it does not require a cosmic hierarchy to be meaningful. Removing the assumption of special status is not diminishing. It is stabilizing. It allows experience to be held without the pressure of living up to an extraordinary identity or fulfilling an imagined role. The purpose of this message, then, is not activation, revelation, or calling. It is not here to wake something up, unlock hidden potential, or initiate a new phase of identity. It is also not here to challenge faith, belief, or spirituality in a confrontational way. Its purpose is interpretive correction. That means gently reorienting how experiences are understood so that they generate less pressure, less urgency, and less internal strain. Interpretive correction does not deny experience. It reframes it in a way that supports regulation, coherence, and long-term stability. Rather than asking what this experience means in a cosmic sense, it asks how this experience is functioning in the nervous system, the psyche, and the sense of self. Many awakening-style messages rely on acceleration. They frame the moment as critical, the timing as exact, and the listener as standing at a threshold that cannot be missed. This framing creates intensity, but it also creates pressure. Pressure narrows perception and reduces choice. The intention here is the opposite to slow perception: widen internal space and restore a sense of safety. When perception slows, interpretation becomes more accurate. When urgency drops, discernment improves. Stability is not the enemy of insight. It is the condition that allows insight to be integrated without harm. Establishing safety is essential. Nothing in what follows requires belief. Nothing needs to be accepted as true, internalized as identity, or acted upon in behavior. There is no test to pass, no alignment to achieve, and no consequence for disengagement. You are not late, early, behind, or ahead. You are not being evaluated. You are not about to miss something irreversible. The absence of pressure is not a trick, it is the point. Any message that demands immediate agreement or frames hesitation as failure is operating through fear, not clarity. This message asks for nothing more than calm attention, and even that is optional. You are allowed to listen without concluding. You are allowed to recognize parts of yourself in symbolic language without committing to the story that accompanies it. You are allowed to feel resonance and remain undecided about its meaning. You are allowed to change your mind later. You are allowed to set this down entirely if it does not feel useful. None of these choices jeopardize your growth, worth, or integrity. Growth is not so fragile that it depends on perfect interpretation, and meaning is not so scarce that it disappears when you pause. By removing the demand to believe or act, the experience itself can settle. When pressure drops, what remains is often more modest and more real curiosity, self-reflection, a desire for coherence, or a need for rest. These are not signs of spiritual failure. They are signs of a system seeking balance. This introduction is an invitation to remain human first, to stay grounded in the body and the present moment, and to allow understanding to emerge gradually rather than be forced into form. If something here resonates, it does not mean you have discovered a hidden truth about your cosmic origin. It means you are attentive to your inner life. If something here does not resonate, it does not mean you are blocked or unready. It means your system knows what it needs and what it does not. Both responses are valid. There is no correct reaction. This space is meant to be steady, not elevating, clarifying, not activating, supportive, not directive. It exists to give your nervous system permission to slow down your mind, permission to not know, and your sense of self permission to remain ordinary, complex, and unfinished. Nothing more is required. Broad, symbolic, and emotionally charged language has a unique capacity to feel personally precise, even when it is not actually specific. And understanding how this works is essential for reducing confusion and unnecessary pressure around experiences of resonance. When language is abstract rather than concrete, it creates space for the listener's own memories, emotions, and identity concerns to fill in the gaps. Phrases like "you have always felt different," "you carry a hidden depth," "you are sensing a shift," or "this message found you for a reason," do not point to verifiable events or measurable traits. Instead, they gesture toward universal human experiences, such as self-reflection, longing, uncertainty, and the desire for meaning. Because these experiences are widespread, almost anyone who is introspective or emotionally sensitive can recognize themselves in the description. The mind naturally completes incomplete patterns, and when a message leaves interpretive space, the listener unconsciously supplies personal details that make the message feel intimate and exact. This process is not deception on the part of the listener. It is a normal cognitive function. Humans are narrative builders, and we are constantly integrating new information into existing self-stories. Symbolic language acts like a mirror rather than a map. It reflects inner material back to the listener without defining its source, cause, or limits, which makes the reflection feel profound. Ambiguity plays a crucial role in this effect. When a message is vague enough to apply to many situations, but emotionally affirmative enough to feel supportive, the brain interprets the fit as accuracy rather than flexibility. This is closely related to what psychology describes as the Barnum or Forer effect, where people rate general personality descriptions as highly accurate because they contain a mix of positive traits, struggles, and open-ended qualifiers. Statements that balance affirmation with challenge are especially powerful, such as suggesting that someone is both sensitive and strong, burdened, yet gifted, confused, yet destined for clarity. These dualities allow listeners to anchor the message to whichever part of themselves feels most active at the moment. Ambiguity also prevents falsification. Because the claims are not precise, they cannot easily be proven wrong. If something resonates, it is taken as confirmation. If something does not, it is often reframed as something that will make sense later, something blocked by fear, or something not yet integrated. This keeps the narrative intact regardless of outcome and increases the sense that the message is operating on a deeper or hidden level. Emotional charge further amplifies this effect by engaging the nervous system rather than just the analytical mind. Language that emphasizes urgency, importance, transformation, or recognition activates emotional arousal, which narrows attention and increases suggestibility. When someone is emotionally engaged, they are less likely to evaluate claims critically and more likely to experience them somatically as a felt sense of truth. This bodily response is then interpreted as evidence that something significant is happening. The feeling of intensity becomes conflated with the idea of accuracy. In reality, intensity often reflects the listener's current psychological state rather than the objective content of the message. Periods of transition, stress, loneliness, or identity questioning heighten emotional responsiveness and make symbolic narratives feel especially potent. During such times, the nervous system is already scanning for coherence and reassurance, and emotionally charged language provides both. Feeling seen in this context is a deeply human response, not a signal of external targeting or hidden identity. When a narrative acknowledges struggle while affirming worth or potential, it meets fundamental psychological needs for validation and meaning. The relief that comes from feeling understood can be profound, especially for people who have felt misunderstood in their personal relationships or social environments. That relief does not require the message to come from a cosmic source to be real. It arises because the language aligns with internal experiences that may not have been previously articulated. Recognition feels external because the words come from outside, but the content they resonate with was already present internally. This is why multiple people can feel uniquely addressed by the same message without contradiction. Each person is recognizing their own inner material through a shared symbolic framework. Importantly, the experience of feeling seen does not provide evidence for claims about destiny, origin, or special status. Psychological resonance explains the mechanism without diminishing the sincerity of the experience. It shows that meaning is being generated through interaction between language and listener, not delivered as a fixed truth from an external authority. When this distinction is missed, resonance can be misinterpreted as selection, as if the message is identifying something objectively rare or hidden about the individual. This misinterpretation often increases pressure because it implies responsibility to live up to the narrative or fear of losing alignment with it. Recognizing the role of projection and ambiguity allows the experience to be held more lightly. Projection does not mean fabrication or self-deception. It means that the mind is actively participating in meaning-making. By understanding that symbolic messages function as prompts rather than diagnoses, listeners can appreciate what resonates without surrendering interpretive authority. The value of the experience then shifts from "this proves something about who I am" to "this highlights themes that matter to me right now." That shift restores agency and reduces dependency on external narratives for self-understanding. It also allows emotional responses to be integrated rather than escalated. When people no longer feel compelled to interpret resonance as evidence of an external origin or a hidden identity, they can remain grounded while still engaging with symbolism in a reflective way. The experience becomes informative rather than directive. It points inward instead of upward or outward. This grounding is especially important because affirming narratives can feel supportive while still subtly encouraging identity inflation or urgency if taken literally. Understanding the psychological mechanics does not invalidate the comfort or insight gained from such messages. It contextualizes them. It reminds the listener that feeling deeply moved does not obligate belief action or self-redefinition. Resonance is a signal of relevance, not revelation. It indicates that the language has touched existing concerns, values, or emotional states. By separating the felt experience from the explanatory framework attached to it, individuals can keep what is useful and discard what creates strain. This approach honors human psychology rather than overriding it with metaphysical conclusions. It allows people to feel seen without needing to be singled out, to feel meaning without needing mystery, and to feel depth without needing destiny. Psychological discomfort, transition, stress, trauma, processing, and what is often labeled as spiritual awakening are frequently blended together in modern language, especially in emotionally charged or symbolic narratives. But they are not the same phenomena and do not arise from the same mechanisms. Differentiating between them is not about dismissing lived experience, but about restoring clarity so that distress is not misinterpreted as advancement and suffering is not given unnecessary meaning. Psychological discomfort is a broad category that includes unease, anxiety, sadness, irritability, restlessness, or disorientation that emerges when internal expectations no longer match external reality. It often appears when beliefs are challenged, routines change, relationships shift, or identity questions surface. This kind of discomfort is not inherently transformative. It is a signal that something is being processed or renegotiated internally. Sometimes it resolves through rest, reflection, or practical adjustment. Sometimes it points to unresolved needs. It does not by itself indicate growth, regression, awakening, or failure. Transition stress is more specific. It arises when a person moves from one life structure to another, such as changing roles, leaving familiar environments, entering new responsibilities, or letting go of identities that once provided stability. Even positive transitions generate stress because the nervous system prefers predictability. During transitions, the brain must constantly update expectations, scan for safety, and recalibrate habits. This produces fatigue, heightened sensitivity, emotional swings, and difficulty concentrating. These symptoms are often mistaken for signs that something big is happening internally, when in fact they are normal adaptive responses. Transition stress does not mean something is wrong, and it does not mean something extraordinary is unfolding. It means the system is working to regain equilibrium. Trauma processing is different again. Trauma responses emerge when past experiences of threat, neglect, or overwhelm are reactivated either consciously or unconsciously. When safety increases or when life slows down, The nervous system may release stored responses that were previously suppressed. This can look like sudden emotional intensity, intrusive memories, body sensations, fear, without clear cause or a sense of fragmentation. Trauma processing is not linear and does not follow a narrative of ascent. It can feel destabilizing precisely because the system is attempting to integrate experiences that were once too much to handle. Importantly, trauma processing does not mean a person is becoming more aware in a cosmic sense. It means the body and mind are trying to complete incomplete protective responses. Assigning spiritual meaning to trauma symptoms can sometimes delay healing by discouraging grounding support or professional care. What is often called spiritual awakening in popular discourse tends to be a loose umbrella term rather than a precise description. It is frequently used to explain periods of questioning value shifts, emotional sensitivity, or disillusionment with previous beliefs. While such periods can involve insight or reorientation, labeling them as awakening can introduce unhelpful assumptions, such as the idea that discomfort is evidence of elevation, that suffering is a prerequisite for insight, or that confusion means one is accessing a higher level of truth. These assumptions can distort self-perception. Pain does not inherently signal progress. The human nervous system experiences pain when overloaded, threatened, deprived, or exhausted. Pain can accompany growth, but it can just as easily accompany harm, misalignment, or lack of support. Treating pain as proof of activation risks romanticizing distress and ignoring basic needs. Confusion is another state that is often misinterpreted. Confusion simply means that existing mental models are no longer sufficient to organize experience. This happens during learning, change, grief, and adaptation. It does not mean hidden knowledge is emerging, nor does it mean insight is imminent. Sometimes confusion resolves through clarification, information, or rest rather than revelation. Fatigue likewise is frequently reframed as energetic upgrade or purging when it is more accurately understood as a sign of sustained cognitive or emotional load. Fatigue indicates that the system has been operating in a heightened state for too long. It is feedback, not failure, and certainly not evidence of spiritual ascent. Emotional intensity is another common human response to change. When routines break down or identities shift, emotions can surge because regulatory structures are temporarily weakened. This can feel profound or overwhelming, but intensity alone does not confer meaning. High emotional charge narrows perspective and increases suggestibility, making experiences feel more significant than they may actually be. Normalizing these responses is crucial. Humans are not designed to move through change without friction. Feeling unsettled, tired, unsure, or emotionally raw during periods of adjustment is not a sign of being behind or ahead. It is a sign of being human. The assumption that discomfort equals progress can create pressure to endure suffering rather than respond to it. It can also lead people to stay in harmful situations or internal states because they believe relief would mean stagnation. This belief system subtly trains people to distrust stability and equate calm with complacency. In reality, sustainable development, whether psychological or existential, often feels quieter than expected. It is marked by increased capacity for rest, nuance, and self-regulation, rather than constant intensity. Growth that endures tends to reduce drama, not amplify it. Differentiating these states allows individuals to respond appropriately. Psychological discomfort may call for reflection or boundary adjustment. Transition stress may call for patience, routine, and support. Trauma processing may call for safety containment and professional guidance. None of these require framing as awakening to be valid or meaningful. Removing the idea that pain must signify progress frees people to care for themselves without guilt. It also reduces the risk of interpreting normal human responses as signs of special status or hidden destiny. Stability is not the opposite of growth. It is often the condition that allows growth to integrate. When people are released from the pressure to interpret every internal shift as symbolic or elevated, they can attend more accurately to what is actually happening. This clarity supports resilience, reduces unnecessary fear, and restores trust in ordinary human processes. Change does not need to be mystical to be real, and discomfort does not need to be glorified to be understood. Identities framed around being chosen different or not from here often emerge during periods of vulnerability, confusion, or emotional pain. And at first, they can feel profoundly soothing. When someone has felt unseen, misunderstood, or chronically out of place, these narratives offer immediate relief by transforming suffering into significance. Instead of pain being random or meaningless, it is reinterpreted as evidence of depth, sensitivity, or a higher role. Loneliness becomes proof of uniqueness. Struggle becomes confirmation of purpose. This reframing can stabilize a wounded sense of self by offering coherence where there was previously fragmentation. It answers the quiet question of, why do I feel like this, with a story that feels dignifying rather than diminishing? In the early stage, this identity functions like emotional anesthesia. It reduces shame, provides belonging within a symbolic group, and replaces confusion with certainty. The person no longer feels defective. They feel selected. However, what soothes initially can later become a source of pressure and isolation because identities based on specialness are inherently unstable. Once someone internalizes the idea that their value or coherence depends on being extraordinary, that extraordinariness must be continuously upheld, specialness stops being a comfort and starts becoming a requirement. The identity shifts from "this explains my pain" to "I must live in a way that proves this explanation is true." At that point, the self is no longer allowed to be ordinary, uncertain, tired, or wrong. Normal human experiences such as doubt, boredom, emotional need, or desire for simplicity begin to feel like threats to identity rather than neutral states. This creates a subtle but persistent anxiety because the person is now guarding a fragile narrative. If they are chosen, what happens if they feel lost? If they are different, what happens if they want to belong? If they are not from here, what happens if they crave stability, routine, or attachment? These natural impulses begin to feel like betrayals of the identity, leading to internal conflict. Specialness becomes something that must be protected, proven, or maintained through interpretation of experience. Every emotion, setback, or coincidence is scanned for meaning to reassure the identity that it is still intact. This constant self-monitoring increases cognitive and emotional load. Life is no longer simply lived, it is evaluated. Moments of distress are no longer just distress, they are tests, signs, or confirmations. Moments of calm can become suspicious, interpreted as stagnation or loss of alignment. This creates a state of chronic vigilance, where the person feels responsible for staying activated, aware, or on path. The identity that once reduced fear now generates it, because the cost of losing specialness feels like losing coherence altogether. Isolation often follows. Identities built on being fundamentally different can subtly discourage mutuality. If one believes they are operating on a different level of awareness, frequency, or origin, it becomes harder to relate horizontally to others without hierarchy. Even when not consciously expressed, this difference can create distance. Conversations feel unsatisfying because they do not match the internal narrative. Shared struggles feel invalid because they threaten uniqueness. Over time, the person may feel increasingly alone, even while believing they are part of something larger. The paradox is that the identity promises belonging while structurally undermining it. It offers connection to an abstract group or cosmic story, but weakens embodied reciprocal relationships. This isolation reinforces the identity further because loneliness is then interpreted as more evidence of being different or chosen, creating a closed loop. Anxiety intensifies when identity depends on extraordinary meaning because ordinary reality inevitably fails to deliver constant confirmation. Daily life is repetitive, ambiguous, and often anticlimactic. When meaning must be extraordinary to be valid, ordinary experiences feel empty or threatening. The person may oscillate between emotional highs when the identity feels affirmed and lows when it feels distant or uncertain. These fluctuations can be misinterpreted as energetic shifts or spiritual tests when they are actually the nervous system responding to an unstable self-concept. The more meaning is concentrated into specialness, the more fragile the sense of self becomes. Any challenge to the narrative, whether internal doubt or external skepticism, can feel like an existential threat rather than a simple disagreement. This often leads to defensiveness, withdrawal, or doubling down on belief rather than integration. Importantly, this dynamic does not arise because the person is naive or weak. It arises because the identity initially met real psychological needs. It provided containment during a period when the self needed protection from overwhelm, shame, or disorientation. The problem is not the comfort it provided, but the rigidity it introduces over time. Healthy identities are flexible and can accommodate change, contradiction, and ordinariness. Identities based on being chosen or different tend to be brittle because they rely on contrast rather than connection. They define the self by exception rather than relation. As a result, growth begins to feel risky. If healing reduces pain, does that mean the identity was false? If stability increases, does that mean purpose is being lost? These questions generate anxiety that keeps the person tethered to intensity. Suffering becomes unconsciously maintained because it confirms meaning. This is where pressure replaces relief. The person may feel compelled to interpret ongoing distress as necessary or even desirable because letting go of it would destabilize the story that once made sense of their life. Highlighting this pattern is not meant to strip meaning from experience, but to relocate it. Meaning that depends on being extraordinary is inherently exhausting. Meaning that allows ordinariness is sustainable. When people are released from the need to be chosen different or not from here, they often feel grief at first because something that once protected them is being softened. But what follows is usually relief. Without the burden of specialness, the self no longer has to perform, interpret, or maintain an identity under pressure. Connection becomes safer because similarity is no longer a threat. Rest becomes permissible because calm no longer implies failure. Identity can reorganize around values, capacities, and relationships rather than exception. The anxiety that once came from guarding extraordinary meaning gives way to a quieter sense of belonging, rooted in shared humanity. What once felt like loss often reveals itself as spaciousness. Phrases such as "this moment, now, or never," and "final activation" are powerful not because they convey precise information, but because they directly engage the brain's threat detection and survival systems, bypassing reflective reasoning and pulling perception into a narrowed, urgent frame. From a neuropsychological perspective, urgency language functions as an implicit signal of danger or loss. Something important is about to happen. Something could be missed. Something irreversible is approaching. The nervous system does not distinguish well between symbolic urgency and literal threat. When the brain encounters cues that imply scarcity of time or opportunity, the amygdala and related limbic structures increase arousal, prioritizing rapid response over careful evaluation. This is an ancient survival adaptation designed for environments where hesitation could mean death, but in modern symbolic contexts, it becomes maladaptive. The phrase "this moment" implies a unique convergence that will not recur, subtly framing the present as fragile and loaded. Now or never intensifies this by introducing a false binary, suggesting that action must occur immediately or be forfeited forever. Final activation adds a layer of existential finality, implying culmination, point of no return, or completion of a long-awaited process. Together, these phrases compress time, inflate stakes, and create the impression that delay equals failure. Once this frame is activated, perception changes. Attention narrows to whatever is presented as relevant to the urgent choice, while alternative interpretations, contextual information, and internal signals of discomfort are suppressed. This narrowing is not metaphorical. It is measurable. Under perceived urgency, the prefrontal cortex, which supports critical thinking, long-term planning, and nuanced judgment, becomes less dominant while faster heuristic-based processing takes over. People become more likely to accept simplified narratives, overlook inconsistencies, and rely on emotional resonance as a proxy for truth. Urgency also reduces tolerance for ambiguity. When something is framed as now, the mind feels pressured to resolve uncertainty quickly, even if the available information is insufficient. This leads to premature conclusions and rigid interpretations. Instead of asking what is actually happening, the question becomes, what am I supposed to do before it's too late? This shift is crucial because it transforms inquiry into compliance. Growth-oriented learning requires spaciousness, repetition, and the ability to revisit assumptions. Urgency collapses that space. It suggests that insight is a one-time event rather than an iterative process. It also externalizes authority. If the moment is critical and fleeting, then whoever names it appears to hold privileged access to timing, meaning, or consequence. This dynamic subtly trains dependency. The listener becomes oriented toward external signals to know when to act, when to awaken, when to decide. Clarity is replaced by vigilance. Instead of developing internal discernment, the person scans for the next urgent cue. Over time, this erodes confidence in one's own pacing and perception. The nervous system learns that calm equals risk and intensity equals truth. This conditioning is especially potent for individuals already experiencing uncertainty fatigue or identity transition. In such states, the promise that this is it can feel stabilizing because it offers an endpoint to ambiguity. However, that stabilization is short-lived. Because urgency-driven meaning cannot be sustained without constant reinforcement, the system requires repeated activation. Each final moment must be followed by another slightly more intense one. This creates a cycle of escalation in which the threshold for feeling convinced or motivated keeps rising. What initially felt clarifying begins to feel exhausting. Importantly, urgency does not enhance insight, it constrains it. Insight emerges when the mind can hold multiple perspectives, tolerate not knowing, and integrate information over time. Urgency actively undermines these conditions. It biases interpretation toward confirmation because disconfirming evidence feels like a threat to the already activated frame. It also discourages rest and reflection, which are essential for consolidation and learning. When people are told that something is now or never, rest begins to feel irresponsible, and skepticism begins to feel dangerous. This is why urgency increases dependency rather than autonomy. A dependent system is one that requires continuous external cues to regulate its internal state. Urgency language keeps the nervous system in a heightened state, making it difficult to settle, self-regulate, or disengage. The person becomes reliant on the next message, the next signal, the next activation to resolve the tension that urgency itself created. Clarity, by contrast, reduces arousal. It feels quieter, slower, and often anticlimactic. It allows for revision and does not demand immediate allegiance. Urgency resists this because clarity would dissolve the frame that keeps attention locked. In this sense, urgency is not neutral emphasis. It is a control mechanism, even when unintentional. It shapes how information is processed, not just how it is received. By recognizing how phrases like "this moment, now or never" and "final activation" function at the level of the nervous system, it becomes possible to separate felt intensity from actual importance. Not everything that feels urgent is meaningful, and not everything meaningful arrives with urgency. Sustainable growth rarely announces itself as a deadline. It unfolds through repetition grounding and the gradual expansion of capacity. When urgency is removed, perception widens, critical thinking returns, and dependency loosens. What remains is not loss, but agency, the ability to engage, reflect, and choose without the pressure of imagined countdowns. Beyond the immediate neurological effects, urgency language also reshapes a person's relationship with time, self-trust, and meaning in ways that persist, even after the message itself fades. When someone repeatedly encounters narratives framed around imminent thresholds or decisive moments, their internal sense of timing becomes distorted. Ordinary developmental rhythms rest doubt repetition. Gradual integrations start to feel inadequate or suspicious. The mind begins to interpret slowness as avoidance and patience as failure. This is especially damaging because most forms of psychological growth, emotional healing, and genuine insight are inherently nonlinear and slow. They involve cycles of advance and retreat, periods of confusion, followed by partial clarity, and long stretches where nothing dramatic seems to happen at all. Urgency collapses these natural cycles into an artificial sprint, creating the illusion that meaningful change must be compressed into a dramatic instant. When that instant inevitably fails to deliver lasting resolution, the individual often blames themselves rather than questioning the framing. They assume they missed it, weren't ready, or didn't activate correctly, reinforcing shame and self-doubt. This self-blame is not accidental. It is a predictable outcome of urgency-based meaning systems. By defining growth as something that happens in a narrow window, these systems make personal worth contingent on perfect timing, rather than sustained effort or adaptability. This undermines resilience, because resilience depends on the belief that one can pause, recover, and re-engage without losing value. Urgency suggests the opposite, that value is fleeting and conditional. Another subtle effect of urgency is its impact on memory and narrative coherence. Under pressure, experiences are encoded with heightened emotional salience but reduced contextual integration. This means people remember how intense something felt, but not necessarily what was said or why it mattered. Later, the intensity itself becomes evidence. It felt huge, therefore it must have been true. This is how urgency decouples feeling from understanding. Over time, individuals may accumulate a series of emotionally charged but poorly integrated experiences, each framed as decisive, yet none providing lasting orientation. The result is a fragmented sense of self oscillating between anticipation and disappointment. Instead of building a coherent narrative of growth, the person lives in episodes of heightened expectation punctuated by collapse. This pattern mirrors trauma dynamics, where hyperarousal alternates with exhaustion. In that sense, urgency does not merely reduce critical thinking, it can actively re-traumatize by keeping the nervous system cycling through stress responses without resolution. It is also important to examine how urgency interacts with identity. When messages imply that this moment is uniquely relevant to a particular kind of person, those who are ready, chosen, or aligned, urgency becomes personalized. The threat is no longer abstract. It is tied to who one believes oneself to be. Missing the moment then feels like a betrayal of identity, not just a missed opportunity. This dramatically increases compliance because the cost of hesitation is framed as self-erasure. The person is not simply choosing whether to engage with an idea, they are choosing whether to remain who they think they are. This is why urgency-driven systems often coexist with specialness narratives. Together, they create a closed loop. You are special. Therefore, this moment matters to you. Therefore, you must act now to remain special. Any doubt threatens the entire structure. From the outside, this can look like conviction, but internally it is often sustained by anxiety. The mind is constantly monitoring for signs that it is still on track, still synchronized with the supposed timing. This vigilance further narrows perception, making it harder to notice contradictory evidence or internal distress. Crucially, urgency discourages metacognition, the ability to step back and examine one's own mental state. When everything is framed as immediate, there is no room to ask, why does this feel so pressing, or what happens if I wait? Waiting itself is cast as a risk, so the reflective pause that could restore balance is avoided. This is how urgency maintains its hold. It does not need to be enforced externally. It becomes self-policing. The individual learns to generate urgency internally, interpreting ordinary fluctuations in mood or attention as signs that another decisive moment is approaching or slipping away. At this stage, dependency is fully internalized. Growth-oriented clarity, by contrast, is anti-urgent. It allows for false starts and revision. It recognizes that insight often arrives indirectly through boredom, repetition, or even apparent stagnation. It does not require constant intensity to validate itself. In fact, one of the markers of genuine clarity is a reduction in perceived pressure. Things feel more optional, not less. Choices expand rather than contract. There is room to test, to disengage, to return later. Urgency-driven narratives often claim to accelerate growth, but what they actually accelerate is commitment without comprehension. They move people quickly into belief or action before understanding has had time to mature. This can create impressive short-term alignment, but poor long-term stability. When the promised clarity fails to materialize, the system compensates by introducing new urgencies, new thresholds, new finales. Each iteration deepens dependency while eroding trust in one's own sense-making. Recognizing this pattern does not require cynicism or dismissal of subjective experience. It simply requires separating intensity from truth and immediacy from importance. A moment can feel powerful without being decisive. A feeling can be compelling without being directive. When urgency is removed from the interpretive frame, the nervous system has a chance to settle and perception widens. Questions become possible again. Alternatives can be considered without threat. Importantly, this does not slow growth. It makes growth sustainable. It allows insight to be integrated into daily life rather than consumed as an event. By understanding how urgency language functions to trigger threat responses, narrow perception, and foster dependency, individuals can reclaim their pacing and authority. They can learn to treat urgency itself as information, not about destiny or timing, but about nervous system activation. In doing so, clarity stops being something to chase before a deadline and becomes something that unfolds through presence, grounding, and time. Noticing qualities such as sensitivity, intuition, emotional depth, pattern recognition, or heightened awareness is a normal part of human development, especially during periods of transition, healing, or increased self-reflection. These qualities are capacities, not identities. They describe how a person may be perceiving or responding in a given season, not who they are in an absolute or permanent sense. The distinction matters because qualities are fluid, contextual, and adjustable, while identities tend to solidify, self-protect, and demand consistency. When a quality is noticed as a quality, it can be used, wrested from, strengthened, or deprioritized depending on circumstances. When that same quality is turned into an identity, it becomes something that must be defended, performed, and preserved. This shift subtly but profoundly changes a person's relationship to their inner experience. Sensitivity, for example, as a quality simply means that someone picks up on nuance, emotional tone, or environmental cues more readily than others in certain contexts. As an identity, I am a sensitive person can harden into a rule that governs behavior, boundaries, and expectations, often without conscious choice. The person may begin to interpret discomfort as proof of who they are, or feel obligated to react in certain ways to remain coherent with that label. Intuition, similarly as a quality, refers to rapid nonverbal pattern integration based on experience, memory, and embodied cues. It is fallible, context-dependent, and strengthened by feedback. As an identity, I am intuitive can become a claim that resists correction. The person may feel that questioning their impressions threatens their sense of self rather than simply refining a skill. Depth, likewise, is a descriptive word for how thoroughly someone processes meaning, emotion, or complexity. As a quality, depth ebbs and flows. Some situations call for it, others do not. As an identity, I am deep can create pressure to find significance everywhere, even when simplicity would be healthier. Identity inflation occurs when descriptive language shifts from "this is something I experience" to "this is what I am." Inflation does not mean arrogance in the traditional sense. It often begins as self-soothing. Assigning identity to a quality can stabilize uncertainty, especially during times when a person feels unseen, misunderstood, or disoriented. Labels provide coherence. They organize experience and reduce ambiguity. In that sense, identity formation around noticing qualities can feel relieving at first. It offers an explanation for difference and a narrative that makes pain feel meaningful. However, over time, the cost of this inflation becomes apparent. Once a quality is identity-bound, flexibility decreases. The person becomes less able to experiment, to be wrong, or to change without experiencing existential threat. Mistakes are no longer just mistakes. They are violations of self-concept. Doubt is no longer informational. It is destabilizing. Fear increases not because the person is weak, but because the stakes have been raised artificially. When identity depends on being perceptive, intuitive, or especially aware, any moment of confusion, misjudgment, or ordinariness feels like a loss of self. This creates a subtle vigilance. The mind monitors its own outputs, scanning for evidence that the identity still holds. This self-surveillance consumes cognitive and emotional energy, often without conscious awareness. It also reduces learning. Learning requires error. Refinement requires feedback. If being wrong threatens identity, feedback will be resisted or reinterpreted to preserve coherence. Over time, this can paradoxically dull the very qualities the identity was meant to honor. Sensitivity becomes reactivity rather than receptivity. Intuition becomes certainty rather than curiosity. Depth becomes rumination rather than insight. Another consequence of identity inflation is temporal rigidity. Qualities are moment-based. Identities imply permanence. A person who notices they are highly sensitive during a period of stress or openness may later find that sensitivity recedes as stability increases. If sensitivity has become identity, this natural shift can feel like loss or betrayal. The person may attempt to maintain heightened states, artificially interpreting calm or neutrality as regression. This keeps the nervous system activated beyond what is necessary or healthy. Awareness does not require this. Awareness is not a fixed trait. It is a mode of attention. It turns on and off depending on context, safety, and purpose. A person can be highly aware in one domain and relatively ordinary in another without contradiction. When awareness is freed from identity, it becomes lighter. It can be engaged intentionally and released without fear. This is one of the most important distinctions: awareness as function versus awareness as self-definition. Function serves life. Self-definition often ends up serving itself. The fear of being wrong is one of the clearest signals that a quality has been over-identified with. When someone is simply noticing being wrong is expected, it is part of calibration. When someone is being wrong feels dangerous. This fear does not mean the person lacks insight. It means insight has been made too central to self-worth. Reducing this fear does not require abandoning awareness. It requires decoupling awareness from identity. One way to understand this is to recognize that noticing qualities arise from conditions. Sleep stress levels, safety, social context, trauma history, and current demands all influence perception. When a person attributes noticing exclusively to who they are, rather than to how they are situated, they overlook the role of environment and embodiment. This can lead to unrealistic expectations and self-blame when capacities fluctuate. Recognizing qualities as emergent rather than inherent restores proportionality. It allows a person to say, "I notice more when I am rested," or "My intuition is sharper when I am grounded," instead of "I should always know." This shift alone can dramatically reduce anxiety. It also restores agency. If awareness is an identity, it must be protected. If awareness is a capacity, it can be supported. The former leads to defensiveness. The latter leads to care. Labels themselves are not the problem. Language is necessary to communicate experience. The problem arises when labels harden prematurely and become explanatory endpoints rather than provisional descriptions. A label that once helped orient experience can quietly become a cage. This often happens when labels are reinforced socially or spiritually, especially when they are framed as rare or elevated. Being told that one's sensitivity or intuition marks them as different, chosen, or especially evolved can feel affirming, but it also raises the cost of disconfirmation. The person may feel pressure to live up to the label or fear losing connection if they no longer fit it. Awareness does not require this scaffolding. In fact, sustained awareness tends to move away from identity claims over time. As perception refines, it becomes more comfortable with not knowing, with partial understanding, with ordinariness. The need to be defined decreases. This is not a loss of depth. It is a sign of integration. Integrated awareness is quieter, less self-referential, and less concerned with how it appears. It does not announce itself. It does not require permanence. It adapts. Emphasizing that awareness does not require a permanent label is not an attempt to strip meaning from experience. It is an attempt to protect experience from becoming brittle. When qualities remain qualities, they can mature. When they are frozen into identity, they often stagnate. The goal is not to reject noticing intuition or sensitivity, but to hold them lightly, to allow them to inform without defining, to let them be present without demanding that they always be present. In this way, awareness becomes a tool rather than a test, a resource rather than a responsibility. And paradoxically, when the pressure to be a certain kind of person dissolves, perception often becomes clearer, not duller. Intuition, synchronicity, and insight are often spoken about as if they are rare, external, or supernatural events that descend upon a person from outside ordinary human functioning. While these experiences can feel profound, unfamiliar, or deeply meaningful, they do not require mystical explanations to be valid. In fact, grounding them in normal cognitive and emotional processes makes them more reliable, more usable, and less destabilizing. Reframing these experiences as human functions rather than cosmic signals does not strip them of meaning. It removes unnecessary pressure and confusion, allowing them to integrate into daily life without exaggeration or fear. Intuition at its core is the brain's capacity to rapidly integrate information without conscious step-by-step reasoning. It draws on memory, prior learning, emotional cues, bodily sensations, and contextual awareness. The brain is constantly processing far more data than conscious thought can track. Intuition is what it feels like when this background processing reaches a provisional conclusion before language catches up. This is why intuition often feels sudden, wordless, or difficult to justify at first. It is not magical, it is compressed cognition. People develop intuition in domains they have lived in, paid attention to, or been emotionally invested in. A therapist may intuit emotional shifts in a room. A mechanic may intuit when an engine sounds wrong. A parent may intuit a child's distress before it is spoken. None of these intuitions require supernatural framing to be accurate. They are expressions of attunement built over time. Emotional intelligence operates in a similar way. It refers to the ability to perceive, interpret, and respond to emotional signals in oneself and others. These signals include tone of voice, facial expression, posture, timing, and inconsistencies between words and behavior. Humans evolved as social beings. Reading emotional cues is a survival skill. When someone feels that they just know what is happening emotionally, they are often registering subtle patterns that have not yet reached conscious articulation. Calling this intuition does not make it less human. It simply names a complex, fast-moving skill. Embodied intuition adds another layer. The body is not separate from cognition. It is one of its primary inputs. The nervous system registers safety, threat, familiarity, and mismatch before the conscious mind formulates explanations. A tight chest, a sudden fatigue, a sense of ease, or a feeling of expansion are not messages from elsewhere. They are physiological responses shaped by experience. Trauma, learning, culture, and context all influence these responses. When someone learns to listen to their body, they are not accessing hidden knowledge. They are paying attention to information that was previously ignored or overridden. This is why embodied intuition becomes clearer with regulation and rest, not with heightened arousal. When the nervous system is overwhelmed, bodily signals become noisy and harder to interpret. When it is grounded, signals become more specific and useful. Synchronicity is often the most mystified of these experiences. It is typically described as meaningful coincidence, the feeling that events align in ways that feel personally significant. From a cognitive perspective, this can be understood through pattern recognition and salience. The human brain is exceptionally good at detecting patterns, even minimal ones. This capacity helped our ancestors survive by noticing changes in environment, behavior, and timing. In periods of transition, uncertainty, or heightened attention, the brain increases its scanning for relevance. Things that were previously filtered out become noticeable. When attention shifts, the world appears to respond, but what has actually changed is perception, not reality. This does not mean the experience is fake. Meaning is real because the person experiences it as real. However, meaning does not require cosmic orchestration to exist. Emotional resonance plays a key role here. When someone is thinking deeply about a topic, symbols related to that topic feel amplified when encountered. A word, number, or image can feel charged because it connects internally, not because it was placed externally. Confirmation bias then strengthens the effect. Instances that fit the emerging pattern are remembered and highlighted, while non-matching instances fade into the background. This is not a flaw. It is how human cognition organizes complexity. Problems arise only when this natural process is interpreted as proof of destiny, instruction, or external guidance that overrides grounded judgment. Insight, similarly, is often framed as revelation when it is more accurately described as reorganization. Insight occurs when existing information is rearranged into a clearer or more coherent structure. It can feel sudden because the reorganization happens beneath conscious awareness until it crosses a threshold. Insight does not come from nowhere. It emerges from engagement, reflection, rest, and integration. This is why insights often appear in quiet moments during walks, showers, or sleep when the mind is not actively forcing conclusions. Demystifying insight allows it to be tested, refined, and applied without inflation. It becomes something to work with rather than something to obey. One of the risks of mystifying these functions is that it externalizes authority. If intuition is believed to come from beyond the self, it becomes unquestionable. If synchronicity is believed to be directed, it becomes directive. This reduces critical thinking and increases dependence on interpretation rather than observation. When intuition is understood as a human process, it can be evaluated. It can be checked against evidence discussed with others and revised. This does not weaken intuition, it strengthens it. Skilled intuition improves through feedback, not through unquestioned trust. Another risk of mystification is instability. If a person believes their value or path depends on extraordinary perception, normal fluctuations in clarity can feel like loss or failure. Fatigue, distraction, or emotional overload can be misinterpreted as spiritual blockage rather than simple human limits. Demystification stabilizes by returning these experiences to a human scale. It allows someone to say, "My intuition is quieter today because I am tired rather than I am disconnected." This reduces anxiety and self-surveillance. Importantly, demystifying does not mean dismissing. It does not reduce intuition to just imagination or synchronicity to nothing at all. It recognizes that meaning is generated through relationship between mind, body, and environment. A moment can be meaningful without being metaphysical. A feeling can be important without being prophetic. Value does not depend on origin story. It depends on usefulness, coherence, and integration. When intuition is grounded, it becomes a guide, not a commander. When synchronicity is grounded, it becomes reflective, not prescriptive. When insight is grounded, it becomes a starting point, not a conclusion. Stabilization is the key outcome of this reframing. Stabilized perception does not rush to interpret. It notices, holds lightly, and waits for corroboration. It remains open to being wrong. It understands that clarity often increases with time, rest, and context. This approach protects against both cynicism and inflation. It allows a person to remain curious without becoming credulous, attentive, without becoming hypervigilant. In this frame, intuition, synchronicity, and insight are not signs of being special. They are signs of being human and attentive. They are capacities that grow with care and shrink under pressure. By removing mystification, these experiences are no longer forced to carry existential weight. They can inform choices without defining identity. They can enrich life without destabilizing it. Ultimately, demystification does not take away wonder, it relocates it. The wonder shifts from "this means I am chosen" to "this is how complex and adaptive the human mind and nervous system are." That shift brings humility, steadiness, and resilience. It allows perception to deepen without losing ground and meaning to arise without demanding belief.